On today's World Insight, commercial space travel off the ground to a great start, with two of the world's richest blasting into space on their own rockets. What's next for the private space industry? Crucial aid from the BRICS international lender amid a global crisis. The new Development Bank's efforts to deal with climate change and the pandemic, in the words of its president, Marcos Troyjo. And a recovery strategy for crisis-stricken Venezuela, spelled out by the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Venezuela, Oscar Figuera.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. 10 days after British billionaire Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Galactic, made his first trip into space, Bezos, the world's wealthiest man, landed safely back on Earth on Tuesday after a successful launch by his private spaceflight company, Blue Origin. Another company, Elon Musk's SpaceX, seems focused on more distant travels, like delivering cargo to the moon, Mars, and beyond. Its Crew Dragon spacecraft carrying 4 astronauts arrived at the International Space Station in April. As the billionaire space race heats up, commercial space tourism is officially taking off. With excitement over anticipated surge in demand for space travel, the sky seems no longer the limit. But will it be a game only for the rich? What's the limit for exploration in the final frontier? For more, let's loop in our panelists. For more, in Washington, D.C., Dr. Amitabh Ghosh, chair of the Science Operations Working Group for NASA Mars Exploration Rover mission. In Reston, Keith Cowan, a former NASA rocket scientist and an editor of NASAWatch.com. In Beijing, Zhang Fan, Associate Professor of Astronomy from Beijing Normal University. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see you. I know it's been quite an exciting 24 hours for many of you, but let me start by asking, how do you see the latest achievement by Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos in terms of making space travel commercially possible? Dr. Ghosh, go to you first.
So it's a very fascinating day today. People have been going to the space station, which is 250 miles away, for 30 years. They stayed in space for 3 minutes. So what is so special about this? What is so special is they're trying to create a market in space. You are witnessing the fledgling birth of a new industry.
Yeah.
It is absolutely fascinating. This is what, the early days of aviation looked like. Nobody wanted to fly. It was so dangerous to fly. It was so expensive to fly. And then why would you want to fly to another continent in 10 hours? So a lot of it looks uncannily similar. It is that these 2 billionaires who are also businessmen, they're trying to create a mass market in space, where the mainstream people, not the governments, not the billionaires, but the mainstream people can actually go and enjoy space, and that becomes kind of a new normal in 10 years.
Well, it seems that the price tag is still a little bit high for, just for common folks. Mr. Cowan, 28 million, that's likely to be the price tag, according to the latest news conference of Blue Origin. But what do you make of the significance of, commercial space travel?
Well, that 28 million, this was a special first time they raffled a ticket off to raise money. And of that 28 million, 19 million was given to a variety of educational organizations. Right. The going rate for Blue Origin or for Virgin Galactic is around $250,000. It's still quite a bit of money. And over time, the thought is that they have 100 million already taken in by Blue Origin and close to that from Virgin Galactic. The idea being that you fly these these rich folks off, and that as the market starts to expand, you add more vehicles, and the customer base grows, and at some point, competition really starts to act where somebody finds a cheaper way to do this or to offer another service, and then suddenly somebody said, I can do that flight without the champagne and with one flight attendant, and then suddenly pure commercial factors came into it.
Yeah.
Now we fly and we complain about not enough legroom.
Well, certainly we see one after another billionaires trying to invest into this commercial outer space travel business. But if you look at the division of labor, it seems quite interesting, isn't it? Branson, Bezos, and also, of course, Musk, they each have chosen a different territory, it seems, and also different groups of partners as well. Tell me more about that, Mr. Cowan. I know you've been covering NASA-related news. Tell me more about your observation.
Well, they're all similar and they're all different simultaneously. Yeah. They overlap. With Blue Origin, they're looking to build a big rocket, and eventually they would like to land things on the moon and go to places outside the low Earth orbit. SpaceX is already doing that. They have contracts with NASA to take cargo to the International Space Station and to cruise, and they are now, with their own money, building a monstrous rocket called Starship, which is larger than anything that has ever flown. Right. And it seeks to drop the cost dramatically to put things into space. And in the middle, you have Virgin Galactic, which is purely into tourism. That's all they really want to do, although they did spin off some of their technology to launch small satellites, which they did just last week. So it depends, as they say, do you want to fly into space for a few minutes, or do you want to go and stay for a while? And, the pricing, again, it's like, do you just want people to give their own money? Do you want to get government contracts? It's a mixture. But somewhere, as you mentioned, they have different audiences. But there's always this overlap because they may try and encroach on each other's territory at some point as the competition factor starts to set in.
I'm sure the market will decide, right? But if you think about it, yes, Dr. Ghosh, their cooperation with NASA and other space agencies that are mainly supported by the states, it's a very interesting approach, isn't it? How do you see that?
I think the vision of NASA, perhaps, to give that push to the private sector so that the private sector can go and find a market which is non-government. So I think that is exactly what is happening. So there is other NASA technology which NASA funds, and then they have become offshoots, and they have found a different market, different from the government. So you can say that that is one of perhaps what NASA tries to do as well. So it fits in with their mandate as well.
Professor Jiang Fan, you've been tentatively listening to your colleagues earlier. Because earlier there were initial development of commercial flights for outer space, also from the Chinese side. What is the latest development?
So it's a bit complicated. So the small startup companies that does rockets in China, there are a few of them, like Link, iSpace, Blue Arrow. They're a lot smaller. They can do rockets that hover and they can land. So they're more on par with what Blue Origin, New Shepard does, but to a lesser extent because their engines are not hydrogen, oxygen. Hydrogen is extremely difficult to work with. They're now racing to try to reach orbit and then come back down again. So there is a vibrant sector in China, but they're generally lagging behind what the US counterparts do. The difference with Chinese situation is that Chinese state sector for the space administration does a lot more than NASA. Its companies, the state-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, they are majority state-owned, but they're also partly privately owned. They're listed on the stock market, so they have a lot of extensive, more commercial enterprises. So a lot of the things that these companies trying to do are being tested out by the state sector in China. And also, in addition to just launching rockets, there are a lot of space utilization things that Chinese companies looking into. For example, manufacturing, medical research, and because the Chinese state sector tends to be concentrating on space infrastructure quite a bit. So I think the possibility for the Chinese niche is not to compete on building more of those similar rockets, but instead to group together leading industry experts on different things, and then having the state sector serve their needs. That's another route for doing it.
You know, there have been a long discussion, even in the U.S., about whether it is possible for commercial space exploration. And now it seems that both technology, governance, and other factors point to the right direction. So tell me more, Mr. Cowing, about this debate going on in the U.S. How do you see this process, and why do we see, quote unquote, an explosion of possibilities now?
Well, why do we see it? It's pretty much organic, and the fact that these things all happen together, it may be coincidence, it may be serendipity. When you have capitalism at work, sometimes it's a mysterious force nobody understands, but it happens. But when it does, and you take notice of it, you harness those forces. Now, one of the things that SpaceX, with its Starship, is actually capable of doing is they not only do they have the funding of a medium-sized nation space program, Elon Musk will have a vehicle that is capable of going to orbit the moon and land on it. Indeed, his proposal for the initial American lander on the moon is a Starship. But it's also the same vehicle that could do a suborbital ballistic hop across half the world. He just changes the engines around and hits the software and it does its thing. So is he doing exploration? He can, but he can also do other things. Whereas with NASA, with like the SLS, that rocket has one purpose, and that's to do exploration with a big program. It doesn't have any commercial use whatsoever. So I think that's the market difference with the private sector is all of their products can do more than one thing, and they're thinking evolutionarily and synergistically and how to do forward and backward compatibility, all the things you see in consumer products, which isn't a coincidence because the three companies have consumer base as their genesis to begin with.
On the other hand, a safety issue is a big one. Earlier, we have seen SpaceX one after another, zigzagging road to success. Meanwhile, we also know Blue Origin, in order to cut the price of the outer space travel, they have almost what some call an amusement park version of what is necessary, for example, with the rocket and many other things. So how do you look at also the test to the limits of safety with all the latest commercial explorations?
That is more an engineering strategy. And I think if you think of Blue Origin and SpaceX, they have had their development go hand in hand with safety concerns, and they have addressed it because so for example, SpaceX, they have developed something with NASA, and so of course they have to ensure safety. So it has to be built into that engineering program. Otherwise, if that guideline, the safety guidelines and requirements are not met, then they would not be allowed to fly.
Mr. Gowing, your take?
In terms of safety, you can't guarantee it. You can get closer and closer to it. It's asymptotic. And at some point you accept the risk that's acceptable because nothing's perfect. Again, they say the only way to be perfectly safe is not to fly. I've had the training to fly in Virgin Galactic, which in the centrifuge, I pulled 6.2 Gs and all that. It's a much more rigorous thing than any, quote, amusement park. And I understand the analogy. So these vehicles are pushing the limit of what a consumer can buy and use in the States. All right. But at some point, it's sort of the sanity test, like Mr. Bezos winning that because he's a bit of a risk taker, but his people told him that it's an acceptable risk. And that's what you get when you start going into this sort of maybe expensive adventure sport, whether it's, I lived at Everest Base Camp for a month with 1,000 people going to climb Everest around me. You write off a piece of paper and say, I'm going to spend all my money, and there's a certain risk that goes with that. But, you have to have a system that's capable of delivering that level of risk that you've accepted. Right. And that's, I think, where the magic comes. You have to test it until it breaks, which is what Elon Musk is doing. And if indeed you go to YouTube, you can see a blooper reel of all the rockets he blew up, because that's how you get there.
Right. Another thing, how are we going to see the outer space is going to be governed? I mean, it sounds like a very political issue, but it's not, because with more, commercial flights into the outer space, people traveling there, it is very much an issue. How people, countries, companies correlate with one another, what is going to be the rule of law, quote unquote, in the outer space, and how are they going to guarantee the safety of everyone? So, Dr. Zhang, tell me more about your thoughts on the latest development as you know it.
Yeah, I think this is really important question because space is by definition international, because the orbit, the way the orbit works, you can't stay just over the top of one nation. It has to be, and you mentioned safety. It's this in space. It's not just safety for themselves, for the astronauts. It's also for other people. For not just safety, but also annoyance. For example, you can say that SpaceX, Starlink is destroying astronomy because they're launching so many thousands of little satellites in low Earth orbit that you can't see through them into the space anymore, and they're beaming radio waves and destroying radio astronomy. And also in the future, there are even more dangerous things. For example, Blue Origin is thinking about space mining, and if they drag an asteroid into Earth's orbit, you really don't want that thing to deorbit and hit Earth. So this kind of things, you need a regulation and you need enforcement, international enforcement. It has to come from, the best I can think of is through strengthening UN into some law enforcement capabilities when it comes to space. But otherwise, I mean, if I'm a company, if you have strong laws, I would just go to an island nation without strong laws, right? But then that's kind of a global governance is really gonna annoy a lot of people on the right of the political spectrum.
Right.
So education, at least to tell people why is this important.
I
be the
see.
beginning.
Awareness.
Yeah.
Mr. Cowan.
I'm sure countries in the equatorial region are probably looking at becoming, their own little, duty-free spaceports. But in terms of governance, one of the things that the U.S. did a couple of years back is something that seems to have sprung forth from a lot of these collaborative treaties that have come before, and they call it the Artemis Accords, which the U.S. started. And I know there was some discussion as to whether it's imposing rules or bringing rules of behavior in, and I think they settled at a low level of accepted norms. And I think it's a dozen or so countries have signed now. Unfortunately, it's sort of seen as an Americo-centric effort, and I know China and Russia said, no, we're gonna do it our way. And probably the similarity is very great, but there's the geopolitical stuff that we have to deal with right now. But that said, there is a hopeful sign. If you look at the International Space Station, and I worked on this back in the 90s, and when they said, well, we're going to bring the Russians in, it was, oh my God, we're all going to die. Well, here we are 20-something years later, and other than really small, almost insignificant incidents, it's been very peaceful up there. And if you read the newspapers, the US and Russia aren't agreeing on a lot of things right now. So you got to ask yourself, why is it that we misbehave on Earth, but up in space, it seems to be very well behaved? There might be something special. It's maybe not something in the air or lack thereof. But there is something about working up there, pun intended. There is something about working up there that seems to just people back off a bit and say, this is a little more important than this, what I want or what you have. And it's working. It's working on the International Space Station. China's space station's up there now. And I'm going to be fascinated to see how two large space stations with overlapping and compatible technology start to, swap stuff back and forth.
For now, thank you, the three of you, for joining us. Keith Gowing, Amitabh Ghosh, Zhang Fan. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, crucial aid from the BRICS international lender amid a global crisis. The new Development Bank's efforts to deal with climate change and the pandemic. In the words of its president. Next. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. BRICS countries are some of the fast emerging economies. The bloc set up the New Development Bank, or NDB, in 2015 to finance infrastructure projects in the developing and emerging world. The Shanghai headquartered bank has pulled its own weight in the battle against many global challenges, such as the climate crisis and the pandemic. But a difficult path still lies ahead. Of huge concern is the real fear that the pandemic has the potential to reverse the hard-fought economic progress made in the bloc for decades. This year, the New Development Bank is celebrating its 6th anniversary. The bank's support for sustainable development and emergency loans has cemented its place for external financing support to BRICS countries. To get a better sense of the lender's mission, I had sat down with Marcos Troyjo, the president of the New Development Bank. Let's listen in. You said cooperation is both your value and a method. How do you see NDB at this point be able to demonstrate that out of quite complicated situations?
I see it with great satisfaction because the New Development Bank 6 years ago was a dream. It was a project. It was something on a piece of paper. And the institution has moved from being an idea to now providing loans to countries, to its member countries. And we do so in a very cooperative way. I mean, in our membership, you have Russia, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and we come to work every day on projects in water, sanitation, urban transportation, smart cities, digital technology, now with an increased emphasis on climate change, on ESG, and cooperation takes place. Cooperation takes place. And I think this is particularly relevant because the name of our institution is New Development Bank, so we have to live up to its own very name. And part of it has to do with membership expansion.
You also see geopolitics really play a role. Your organization, which is a multilateral institution, of course you're mainly of emerging economies, but you're also thinking about, expanding with membership. How do you look at, what is going on in the world? What does it mean?
You mentioned something about geopolitics. Great power competition is not new in history, right? I mean, it's something that we have seen a lot. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we don't have to go too far back into the past. Merely the last 200 years have shown how great power politics has been part of the landscape. Mm-hmm. I think the difference here is, once again, the marriage between responsibility and leadership, learning those histories, and trying not to fall into the traps that the political cycles present to you. The concrete experience of the New Development Bank goes in this direction. You're talking about countries that are truly very representative in their regions.
What is your plan trying to build trust?
Yes, I think that's a very important question because at the very beginning of some banking institutions, they were called trust, right? So trust and banking is something that goes hand in hand.
Yes.
I know no better way of establishing trust than to establishing day-to-day coexistence. One of the reasons why I think the NDB has been so successful from being just an idea to becoming a player is that these different countries, they come to work every day. So we interact every day. We understand from different cultures, different civilizational backgrounds. The world is very different. The world is very different. It's beautiful. It's different. Diversity. But then sometimes this kind of differences, they hold you back. And when you understand them and you're able to see how they play out on a particular project, then understanding is broadened. You can build consensus. Mm-hmm. Consensus is another very beautiful word because it means going in the same direction as of an agreed perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think we're accomplishing that at the bank. Let us work every day so that this trust is one of the most distinguished features of the New Development Bank.
Mr. President, how do you see the potential of the so-called green development and green cooperation?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's important for us to realize that we are passengers on the same boat, which is our planet. So climate change, like the pandemic, they also need multilaterally built solutions. And I think this is one of the ways forward that we can adopt to promote a greener economy. There are many aspects with which you can call something green now. I think one of them, of course, is related to green financing. There is both an appetite and a goodwill. It's in the spirit of the times for institutions to provide liquidity and resources for projects that are green, that will allow for the economy to be less harmful to the environment. So I think this is a positive aspect, and one in which the new Development Bank can also play a role, which is to look for those sources of funding, putting them together in attractive projects, and making them available to our member countries. There's something also that has to do with the transition of our economies. I mean, many countries in the world, especially those that have seen their rise in the first industrial revolution, have used up all possible sources of energy. And I think one risk that we cannot run is to repeat the mistakes of the past. So we have to travel on a different path. And this new path also allows for the transition of some of our economies. Emerging economies do rely still a lot on fossil fuel related sources of energy. So there's mitigation, there's adaptation, and there is transition to something that is green. This is a journey. We're not going to do that from one day to the next.
Numbers that are suggesting the amount of financial investment I'm talking about all over the world so far about the green, with the name of the green, only 3% eventually brings real results of green development.
Right.
That to us is a very interesting, if not a challenging number.
Yeah.
So how to make sure it's not just a green wash?
Well, I think it's going to depend very much on what your definition of green is. This green definition, once again, it has to be built multilaterally. We want to make sure that no country imposes what the green is to the rest of the world.
What is ESG, right?
Yeah, ESG. I mean, ESG is something that is also the result of a collective construction. I mean, we have to have common rules. If we're talking about international law, and ESG offers benchmarks, then it has to be built multilaterally as well. In the same sense that in the past we used to look at physical infrastructure on the one hand and technological infrastructure on the other, as if they were two separate things, reality is bringing them together. There is a kind of a fusion, there is a merger between physical infrastructure and technological infrastructure. So it is wrong for you to say that, for example, your institution has to have a special perspective to technology, because technology is everywhere. The same thing about what is green, the same thing about what is sustainable. So if you're talking about, say, building railways, there's something green about it, right? It can be more green or less green when it comes to conceiving the project, to the ESG criteria that you're using, the sort of references that you have, the local associates that you can relate to so that the implementation is the best one possible. So no matter what area of infrastructure you're talking about, there's something green about it. But when it comes to project implementation, obviously there are areas like clean energy that are more obviously related to carbon neutrality and to going green.
You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, a recovery strategy for crisis-stricken Venezuela, spelled out by the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Venezuela, Oscar Figuera. That interview after that. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Venezuela, home to the world's largest proven oil reserves, has been going through a spiraling political and economic crisis in recent years. The country is in its 7th year of recession, one of the steepest ever recorded in the world. Its economy is under crippling US sanctions and now had to contend with the fallout from the pandemic. The economic situation remains dire. Frequent power outages have plunged Venezuela into darkness, chronic shortage of food supplies, and punishing hyperinflation. The past years have been exceptionally tough for the country. How the country recover from the crisis? What sort of governance will they take to carry out good policies? For answers, I try to get some perspectives from Oscar Figuera, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of that country. Here's his perspectives. I remember last time when we were trying to connect with one another, there was a big power problem inside your country because of the US sanctions against Venezuela. Tell me more about how you are functioning, your country, under such circumstances.
Bueno, hay una realidad que se ha.
There is a reality that has settled in Venezuela and is related to the legality of the unilateral measures that the United States government, since the Obama administration, decided to impose on our country by declaring that Venezuela is a threat to the national security of the United States and apply an executive order that, under Trump, directly affected the Venezuelan economy. This has to do with the use of exchange, of commercialization, of acquisition of credits at an international level, of purchase of necessary products for the country's industry.
De créditos a nivel internacional, de compra de productos necesarios para la industria.
So the complete picture is a consequence of those measures from the U.S. administration which are related to imposing sanctions. These we reject because we do not recognize the extraterritoriality of the laws of the U.S. government, of U.S. imperialism, and therefore we condemn them and reject them. And the Communist Party of Venezuela is part of the forces that we have fully mobilized in the face of any threat or aggression that may be carried out against our country. So, the illegal, unilateral, and coercive measures of the U.S. government, the U.S. administration, has effectively caused significant damage to our country's economy and affect us not only in the electricity sector, but also in other important areas such as oil, gas, and food. In general, everything that implies the acquisition of goods, products, commerce, financial and economic relations at a general level. This conduct of aggression, coercion, interference, disrespect for the sovereignty and self-determination of peoples is condemned by the Communist Party of Venezuela.
De injerencia, de irrespeto a la soberanía y a la autodeterminación de los pueblos es condenada por el Partido Comunista de Venezuela.
Were you disappointed that the Biden administration, after coming into the office for more than 5 months, still continued the policies that were designed by the Trump administration?
Bueno, nosotros partimos de una caracterización que hacemos de la administración.
Well, we see from a characterization that we make of the United States government and institutions. The U.S. state is an instrument at the service of the big capital, large transnational corporations, or large multinational corporations. The U.S. government and institutions seek to defend the interests of big capital at the international level.
Un aparato para defender a nivel internacional los intereses del gran capital.
So administrations, whether Democrat or Republican, in general, maintain a policy in this regard. They can maintain different tactical maneuvers, a more confrontational discourse in the case of Republicans, or more sweetened in the case of Democrats, but they all defend the hegemony and domination objectives of U.S. imperialism. That is the perception of the Communist Party of Venezuela.
Esa es la apreciación del Partido Comunista de Venezuela.
One of the things we all have to focus on is how to bring better life to people. Of course, your country, my country, has very different circumstances, but anti-poverty campaign is very important. Mr. Figuera, tell me more about how you are, together with your party members, trying to make as much effort as possible in that regard.
Bueno, efectivamente la situación.
Well, indeed, the situation of the People's Republic of China and the situation of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela are different due to both their material base and development and the empowerment of the productive forces. Obviously, China has achieved high levels of development, which today places the economy of the People's Republic of China in the first level of world development and in competition with the large economies that have exercised hegemony and that had and continue to have imperialist practices worldwide. So, the People's Republic of China has been fulfilling a really important function with its approach that allows the incorporation of other economies and contributes to the participation of other countries in the development process in the world.
De otros países en el proceso de desarrollo a nivel mundial.
The Venezuelan case is more complex in terms of our difficulties, regardless of the fact that the People's Republic of China has, according to my latest data, 1.45 billion citizens. Regardless of the fact that this is an immense population, it is a material base that the Chinese Revolution has built, which has allowed for an accelerated leap and the improvement of the quality of life of the Chinese people. In the Venezuelan case, the situation has been different because the Venezuelan economy has been an oil-dependent economy. We characterize it, the Communist Party, as a single export and multi-import economy with a great dependence on international imports. Its income has been generated mainly through the export of oil.
Han sido generados fundamentalmente por la vía de la exportación de petróleos.
I am very sympathetic and also have huge empathy toward your circumstances, particularly at a time when your country has to function because of the COVID-19 challenge. Tell me more about the latest situation in Venezuela and how are you having access to prevention and control?
Bueno, estos son tiempos, como usted lo ha señalado.
These are times, as you have pointed out, that allow countries to build their internal capacities, their creativity, and based on a centralized plan, to attack the weaknesses of their own development and advance in overcoming the reality imposed by these development weaknesses and by the unilateral, coercive measures of external aggression. This is fundamental, and it is an element on which the Venezuelan approach must be taken. It is one of the approaches that the Communist Party of Venezuela has undertaken, the need to advance in a planned development process where primary production, which is related to food and the guarantee of food sovereignty, must play a very important role. Things are being done in this direction, and we consider in the Communist Party that they can be of greater depth, of greater scope, and that it is important to continue working from the institutions of the state and society with the popular movement, the popular power, as we say here in Venezuela, with the participation of blue collars, peasants, the community, co-proprietors, and workers in general, of the popular movement, the sectors of the intelligentsia, the middle class, the scientific and technical sectors. It is very important to enhance the role of science and technology in our country. Progress is being made in that direction, but these efforts must be deepened.
Se viene avanzando en esa dirección, pero hay que profundizar esos esfuerzos.
Venezuela, the government of President Nicolás Maduro, has been battling the pandemic with measures. First, one was to assume at the time, we could say timely, the decisions of social control, separation, social dialogue, or physical distancing. The president carried it out on time, as well as measures to maintain a lockdown, which is an important measure that the government of President Maduro took in March 2020. We can say it was in a timely manner. That, along with other realities, which are the realities that have been beyond the government itself, well, the coercive and isolation measures resulted in that. When the pandemic happened, international flights in Venezuela were scarce, because that must also be noted. The presence of tourists and international visitors was reduced to a minimum. The pandemic, along with the unilateral and coercive measures of the U.S. administration, had forced isolation on the country, with little presence of international visitors. That is an element that must be taken into account.
De visitantes internacionales. Eso es un elemento que hay que tener en cuenta.
And third, something we value immensely has been the solidarity of the government of the People's Republic of China. Actually, the Russian Federation has also played an important role. The comrades of Cuba, of the Cuban Revolution, have played an important role in solidarity with our country. It is this immense solidarity with our country, but solidarity with the government and the Cuban people. The Cuban government and people historically have helped the peoples of Latin America and have developed internal processes aimed at meeting the social, political, and social demands of the Cuban people amid the murderous blockade. This is the same thing today the Communist Party of Venezuela condemns and rejects as an attempt of the U.S. administration to subvert the internal situation in Cuba. Our solidarity with the Cuban people, our solidarity with the government of Cuba.
nuestra solidaridad con el pueblo cubano, nuestra solidaridad con el gobierno de la República de Cuba.
China has 4 decades of reform and opening up that has enabled the country to enjoy development, which is a right, a human right, every human on this world should have. Now, how would you reflect upon China's approach? How do you see your country's possible path so that people could enjoy development?
Bueno, desde el Partido Comunista de Venezuela,
we at the Communist Party of Venezuela believe that the Venezuelan government and the state should deepen processes of building strategic alliances at the international level. Strategic alliances that must protect the sovereignty of the country and must be obviously beneficial for those with whom the government, the Venezuelan state, makes international alliances, guaranteeing the sovereignty of Venezuela over natural resources and production. There must be agreements that guarantee technology transfer, that guarantee the scientific and technological advance of our country.
Que garanticen el avance científico y tecnológico de nuestro país.
In other words, the Communist Party of Venezuela is aware that nowadays no country, no lonely economy can develop for the benefit of its people. This is also the case in Venezuela. Then, international alliances that maintain sovereignty over natural resources and our production processes is a very important factor for us, along with other aspects related to what we consider fundamental in the development of an economy that also contributes to the revolutionary transformation of Venezuelan society. This is related with a much more direct, effective, and active participation of workers, the communal councils, the communes, the peasant sectors, and obviously in general, the intelligentsia, the science and technology sectors.
De la intelectualidad y los sectores de la ciencia y la tecnología.
A comprehensive plan that considers these aspects, in which the rights of workers are at the center of those objectives. We propose development to benefit our people. We propose development to benefit the working class in the city and in the countryside. And if the efforts we make fundamentally benefit capitalist sectors, they are obviously not in the right direction, according to the Communist Party of Venezuela.
No está en la dirección correcta, consideramos, en el Partido Comunista de Venezuela.
My earlier interview on Venezuela. That's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight. Check our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.